Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and welcome back to my series of CSM interviews. The last two that we're going to be covering just before the election starts on Monday are going to be ones that have slight differences compared to the other ones. In this case, Cornak was someone who I'd hoped to interview in the initial round of interviews. However, due to some scheduling issues, we weren't able to actually get that done before the first interviews started coming out. And as a result of that, Cornak was potentially able to listen to some of the questions beforehand. I feel it's important to let people know that just in advance, as that does potentially give him an advantage over other candidates when it comes to answering these questions. However, I made the decision that doing an interview even under suboptimal circumstances was better than not doing any interview at all. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's let the candidate introduce themselves.
All right, so my name's Cornak Firefist. I'm the CEO of Dreaded and the TA director for Test Alliance. I've spent a good amount of time previously running Brave, before that in Wormhole Corp, and before that in RVB, plus some sideline stuff like doing high-sec mining that everyone does when they're initially started out. I've got a good amount of experience with all sorts of parts of the game, in large part because I have alts in a lot of parts of the game, so that allows me to see a lot of things you wouldn't otherwise get to see. I've spent a good amount of time working through the whole campaign while I'm running that kind of thing. The biggest thing I think I bring to the table is more as a voice of stability. There's a lot of kind of firebrand candidates out there who tend to go hardcore on one thing or overreact to situations. Eve is a very delicate game with a whole lot of moving parts, so having a more moderating influence is very important, because otherwise you end up in scenarios where one little change can end up destroying the entire economy as a whole. Like even just changing the refining nature of railguns, that completely changed how Eve's industry worked. The switch over to compressed ore, like it's a big deal when you have this many little bits and pieces. So it's important to have someone who's able to go, okay, this is, like, kind of take a step back and say, this is what could happen here. This is what can possibly go wrong. On the two issues I basically specifically care about, the first big one, as you might expect, is balance, because it's really the biggest part of that. Balance affects everything. It's
We're going to get to questions about what you want to focus on later, so.
okay.
So one of the first sessions that the CSM will typically have at a summit is a meeting with the upper leadership of EVE Online's development team. And typically the CSM as a whole has tried to present a list of 3 to 4 points that all members agree need work on during this. What is a point that you think that you can convince the CSM, the rest of the CSM, deserves to be on that list for your first summit?
The biggest one is the speed of balance changes in Eve. Right now, it tends to be on a year cycle or so of big balance reduxes. There's a lot of little things that should be changed in a shorter time span than that tend to go without any kind of effect for those multi-year periods. I mean, there's been a constant case of hacks or drakes or maelstroms being just overwhelmingly dominant in the meta, and that's a bad thing. When you have these smaller balance cycles, like 1.5 month balance cycles, you're not able to do as many large changes, but what you are able to do is make a lot of small changes, and if it breaks something, you're able to fix it really fast. So you can tweak the numbers on ships, like say, okay, we're going to increase the rate of fire on medium autocannons, or decrease the range on a Ferox. And if that just suddenly shows up like, okay, now autocannon hurricanes are the most overwhelmingly dominant thing in the meta, you can go, all right, we're going to fix that, and this will actually be fixed in a month and a half, as opposed to sitting and just overwhelming the game for a year at a time. So when you have these short balance changes, you're able to hit a lot more things a lot faster. You still obviously want to have those like big total revamps like you saw with capitals or citadels. I mean, Tiercide is a great example of that, where it's basically completely redoing the way a lot of things work. So you still want to have those on your yearly basis, but adding in your much shorter term balance changes really kind of fixes a lot of the issues you tend to see in Eve. Like a lot of things stem back from the fact that things change very, very slowly.
Do you believe that you can convince the whole of the CSM that this deserves to be a point that's presented by everyone?
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty predominant issue that you see a lot of things tend to result from, and I mean it really affects almost every area of the game because almost every area has little tweaks that can be done. Like you can have isogen changes in industry to the previously mentioned PvP changes. Like it's a fairly encompassing point that is not so specific that it can be easily ignored. Like it I think would have the single most effect of anything you could really bring up.
During CSM 12, I was asked to present a list of 3 separate areas of the game that I felt CCP would gain a lot from working on in order to spur discussion within the CSM. If you were put in a similar position, what 3 areas of the game would you bring up?
Three things that are most important. The first one, as previously mentioned, is balanced. The next one is botting. There's been a whole lot of attention to it recently, and it's one of my kind of pet issues. I one of the roles of my job and test is to hunt down and kill botters. It's quite a lot of fun, and I enjoy it a lot, and it gives me a pretty good perspective on it as a whole. Uh, right now, botting has seen a lot of gains from a few different areas. The first one and most prominent is the ease of making new accounts. Since with alpha accounts, you don't have to have that initial Plex investment. You can just go, all right, I'm going to make this VNI. It's not going to be as effective as an Omega VNI, but it's still going to be effective enough to justify running it if you're running it for, say, 18 hours a day, something like that. So when you're able to run those ratting bots constantly, then it evens out in the end, which means that when people get banned, they simply make new accounts instead of giving up, essentially. What that means is you're seeing a lot more botting going on. I think the increases in ratting bounties that have been happening recently are in part due to that. The other big one is just the way that PvE works in Eve. Eve still has a much older method of PvE compared to a lot of other games. There's it's pretty much the same system that's been in there for ages and ages and ages and ages. So that tends to create a situation where people get bored out of their mind and go, "Well, I'm just gonna bot all day because they're like, there's nothing gonna stop me, and it means I don't have to do this incredibly boring thing." So they have made a lot of progress there with like abyssals, burners, that kind of thing to add new types of PVE. But I still think that the fundamental nature of PvE right now is you want to spend the least amount of human time possible, and because of the not so great enforcement, there's a lot of incentive to take the botting method. So the third one then is that not so great enforcement where you're you're seeing a lot of bot bans, but you're not seeing enough bot bans, and a lot of that is because it's really easy to just shove new bots in. So you're really on a low risk factor where you don't take much issue if you do get banned, since you can make that new one. So you see a lot of corps, a lot of alliances willing to take the tax money from that and just kind of look the other way. So they don't really tend to patrol for it. So if you add an additional effect, and it's why I really like the things where they teleport the bots to high sec, that kind of thing, since it brings it into the open and says, hey, this is an issue, and therefore causes alliances to go, okay, maybe we should deal with this a bit more. Because when you have not only CCP going after bots, but you also have alliances going after bots, that means that they don't really have an area to make money, and therefore there's a lot less incentive to start botting. But basically, the goal here is to take away the incentives to bot while also beating them to death with a stick. And then, so the third one is the new player experience, and as part of that, faction warfare. So right now, CCP's released stats recently where I think it's like 90% of people stop playing after the first 30 days or something like that, and 10,000 people try the game each week. New people try the game each week, so that's a pretty big drop off. That's a really bad thing from a retention perspective, but it does. There's a lot of hope there from a Eve is still attracting players perspective. So the trick here is to figure out how do you hold on to those players, since there's a ton of people trying Eve. Like, the marketing is not really the issue; it's getting them to stick around after they've tried it. So the biggest thing there, I think they can really do is, so they've been making a lot of good progress with the new player experience, but and there are a bunch of things that can be changed there, which I outline on my website in the high sec section. But the biggest single thing that I think can be done is to really redo faction warfare and make it a whole lot more engaging and fix a lot of the issues that came in post Citadel, and then drive new players to do faction warfare. Since faction warfare gives you clear objectives and a way to make money while PvPing. And one of the big statistics that CCP always likes to trot out is people who lose a ship in their first few days are much more likely to stick with the game than people who don't. So if you can get people out into faction warfare, get them PvP, and get them to go, wow, this is actually a pretty cool game. And then when they inevitably die, they have some money because they've been flexing in faction warfare. They're able to get a new ship and just keep going out there. But faction warfare is probably the most uniquely suited aspect of Eve for really fitting in with a lot of preconceived notions of the game. Like, you have pretty constant PvP action, and you have a way to go, like, this is what I should be doing. Since people come in from, I mean, I'm going to say World of Warcraft here, that's just more of a general example, and they go, like, where's my quest? What should I be doing? And missions are a terrible trap for that, because missions are horribly boring. But with faction warfare, you go like, oh, I should take this system. This is really cool. I'm doing something. I'm having an effect. I can see my actions are changing the universe. Like, that's why I think a lot of people join Eve, and that's why I think faction warfare is so important.
What do you perceive to be the problems with faction warfare right now?
So there's a few big ones going on with it. It's struggled particularly recently, and by recently I mean the past 3 years. Recently, due to the Citadel changes. So stations before Citadel came out, you when one faction would take a system, the other faction could not dock in that system. It meant that taking a system actually had an effect. You lost something if you lost it. You gained something if you gained it. There are also some like system bonuses to industry that you get by taking a system that they aren't really that good. So that's not super relevant. But when Citadel came out, that meant you can drop a Citadel in any system, and then you're just always dockable. So the first big issue that caused is it took away any incentive to actually take systems into Warzone, since like your level 4 agents, you still can't dock at, but that's not exactly the end of the world when you can do just about everything else. So you end up with these citadels just falling all over space, where it doesn't really matter where you are because you're living out of a citadel anyway. The other big thing that then causes is, if you're in faction warfare, the way sieges work is, you normally, before Citadel, you would drop a POS in the hostile system. You'd shove a bunch of SMAs in the POS, you'd load it up with a ton of ships, and then you'd use those for your reships. So that gave the defenders a lot more of an advantage in system contests, because they were able to reship locally from a station, and it's a whole lot easier to reship from a station than it is from a POS, and to keep that station stocked compared to the POS, because you can just jump freighter to a station, assemble everything there, and bam, it's done. With a POS, you have to assemble everything in another station, load up like a carrier or something like that with a bunch of ships, then shuttle them over to the POS, and that creates a lot more of a logistics draw on the attacker. So that created an inherent bonus to the defender, not necessarily from like a gameplay thing or a game mechanic, but more of an indirect gameplay aspect. So when Citadel came out, now you have the ability to put up a dockable structure that works essentially like a station. Like, it's actually better than a station because you have tether. and you just drop it in low sec, and now you can dock. So now there is not really a defender's advantage. There's the attacker and defender are on the same kind of level because they're able to really just drop citadels. So that kind of ruined that kind of siege warfare that you saw where, I mean, that's not to say you don't get sieges still. You just see a lot fewer sieges and a lot fewer groups willing to do those sieges because ultimately it means nothing. And what that does is it then makes faction warfare a lot more vulnerable to the economic issues, which are right now faction warfare in the war zone. And this is true, though to a lesser extent, even before Citadel came out. Like Citadel is not solely to blame for this, but with the tier system, you have a big issue with farmers. So farmers tend to go back and forth, where they crank one side up to tier 4 or 5, make a ton of LP, then hoard that LP, and then crank the other side up. Like they literally just hop onto the other side and start moving that side up to tier 4 or 5 and make a ton of LP there. But while that's happening, the other side, so say they hop from Galenti to Caldari, Galenti LP is then skyrocketing in price, and now VNI BPCs are worth a whole lot more. So they're then able to offload that LP that they got in under the tier 5 mechanics where you're making way, way more LP than at any other tier, and make a ton of money because of that. And then you're making as well more LP that you can offload later on from the Caldari side. So it just creates a cycle of eternal farming. So what that does is it means that people are a lot less incentivized to care about faction warfare because you can do a lot of stuff, but ultimately a lot of that push tends to come just from the farmers. Like it's possible for faction warfare, like dedicated faction warfare groups, to influence that twist back and forth, but you're just not seeing any kind of effect compared to what the farmers are doing. Like you're working so hard to counter that a lot of times people go, this isn't worth it, and they leave faction warfare, and that's ultimately a bad thing. I mean, you've seen a massive decrease in the number of groups that have been in faction warfare recently, and like Fed Up joined joined Legacy, which is absurd in any possible way. Like they are the quintessential faction warfare corp, and they're in nullsec. So it's you've really seen a significant drop off there, which leads to a lot of those lower retention rates where you're if you join faction warfare, you're not really able to get much out of it because so many big groups are leaving the war zone that you just don't really have anything to do. Like once you're in faction warfare, like this isn't that much fun because everything that used to make faction warfare so good is pretty much gone. So the way I think you deal with these issues is you really don't want to have faction warfare citadels dockable. That's a pretty simple solution, and that is by no means the only, like, that's not a cure-all or anything like that, but that's probably the easiest one to implement. Like basically just set up essentially a mandatory in-game ACL that specifically excludes those factions, and that would help a lot with that issue. The other big one is you do want to have some kind of pause replacement when pauses leave. This part is not so much an issue that is currently happening as an issue that will happen in the future when pauses are removed. Since right now, one of the big things missing from the kind of structured lineup that you have with Citadels is some sort of FOB where you can drop it pretty fast. It doesn't really have much capability, like you can't dock with it or anything like that. Like it's basically a space maintenance array that's in space, and that allows you to kind of replicate that kind of system siege gameplay. CCP has previously said they are not so interested in doing that, which I think is really unfortunate and is going to have a lot of negative effects, not just for LowSec, but for stuff like wormholes and that kind of thing. Like it's a pretty massive oversight to ignore. Then on the economic side, I'd like to see a lot more of a shift away from missions as the primary income and towards plexing. So basically buffing the amount of LP you get from plexes, and you unfortunately can't really directly buff PvP, but what you can do is tie your LP modifiers that currently you get from the tier system, tie those to a rank system where right now when you're in faction warfare, you get a series of ranks going up, and each one has their own like fluffy rank pattern. They don't really do anything right now other than look cool, and you get some standings bonuses. So if you tie also the LP rewards to that, that incentivizes people to stick with that one faction and keep going on it. And it means that when the farmers are going back and forth, then they're not going back and forth between the characters. Your LP income is unaffected, and what that means is there's less incentive for those farmers to do that because you still have a lot of people with the equivalent of tier 5 LP gain on the other side still making that LP to keep the prices a lot more constant, so you can't really get that kind of pump and dump scheme that you have right now. And then basically when you leave your faction, that would reset, which it does not now, but I think would be good if it did.
So part of being a CSM member is being able to explain gameplay patterns or uses of mechanics that feel broken to CCP in order to show why they're not something that you feel is healthy for the game. Can you describe something that you have experience with that you perceive to be broken, or at least overpowered, and explain why it is overpowered or broken in your view?
So the thing I think is, to me personally, like something that I have the most experience with being overpowered is actually spies. I say this as the person who directly benefits from that overpoweredness, but Spy's got a significant number of buffs, especially with the changeover to ESI, that you wouldn't really think about. It's one of the areas of the game that is a lot harder to really balance. Like you can't just really change a number and say like this gun fires faster, but for spies, it's a lot trickier of a thing. So when ESI came out, the changes to the amount of access you had with the ESI API and the way it works, where it's characters, like individual characters, as opposed to accounts, plus the fact that you're no longer required to put anything on the character bazaar for your, like if you buy and sell characters, means that it's very, very easy to just go like, okay, I'm going to get an Omega account and bam, I have 3 alts and 3 alliances kind of thing. Like it's your barrier to entry is a lot lower because you can just buy a character or use all 3 slots on your account like you could never before. So that's meant that it's much, much easier for me to basically get all my fingers in all sorts of pies and have stuff going on. Like there's a balance to be had where Eve definitely should not have no spies, and I will be the first one to say that because that would kind of ruin a lot of my gameplay. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be so possible that I can have so many spies and so many alliances and be able to have entire corps literally be just spy corps in an alliance like that. It is ridiculous that I can do this, and it should not be possible. Ridiculous that it is this easy. I mean, it should not be possible that it's this easy. Let me clarify that before it's misinterpreted. I think you should always have that potential, but it should not become so easily. You should have to work more for it. And like I think we're really in a bad state right now where the CI capabilities of a lot of alliances have dropped, and correspondingly, the spying capabilities have increased. And the way I think to fix that is by, and unfortunately, CCP has proven very resistant to this, but like there are some serious changes that could be made to the API system. Those changes are unfortunately not likely to be made, but nonetheless, it would be good. The other big one is Corps and Alliance mechanics really need a whole redo. They're probably one of the oldest, most spaghetti-coated sections of the game remaining after the Citadel revamp. Alliances are literally just a kind of patchwork system where someone went, okay, what if we made a corp, but instead of characters as members, it was corps as members, and that's how they made alliances. So the roles system, the hangar system, even like your audits, that kind of thing, those are so outdated that they are functionally useless. And require corps to have these elaborate external IT infrastructures to really exist uh, at all. It's pushed people too much towards those out of game tools, and I think that especially for like new players, new corps, that kind of thing, or corps with low resources, it's important that they have in-game tools that are actually able to handle it. Like switching roles over to the ACL system, that kind of thing would go a long way towards making it so that if you get a role in a corp right now, you have basically carte blanche to do anything. You can steal just about anything from any hangar, that kind of thing. And it should not be buffed so much that you have like a perfect record of like, okay, X stole Y from Z hangar, but it should not be so bad as it is right now.
So you mentioned changes to the ESI, or the fact that you feel the ESI need to be changed, but you didn't go into any detail on what you would like to see changed. Can you go into more detail on what you think would be best?
So the biggest, like number one issue, like the biggest buff that happened to Spine was when the ESI was changed to be characters as opposed to XML, where you could have a full account API. So what that meant is you now have the ability to have three characters, all of which show as Omega characters on a single account, and treat them as if they were on three different accounts, which means you can be in three different alliances on those Omega characters. So that sets up a situation where it's dramatically easier to get a lot of stuff done there. So the number one thing would be putting it back to an account API system, which would also have a corresponding ease of use effect, as I'm sure a lot of people have seen, where it's a pain in the ass to sign in to like JEV assets or whatever with every individual character instead of doing it an account at a time. But that is the number one thing that I really think was a massive mistake by CCP when they updated from the XML to Crest and the ESI.
So the CSM has to give input on many things, even on things that aren't normally thought of as normally coming under the CSM's purview, such as UI design. In fact, a meeting with the UI team, Team Psycho Sisters, is a part of most summits. As such, can you describe a part of the UI that you interact with heavily and identify a problem with it when used in the way that you operate it?
So this is actually one of the biggest things I think it drives a lot of that retention loss. Eve has a very old UI, and there have been efforts to update sections of it, but at its root, it's pretty difficult for new players coming in to interpret. I know that I bounced off Eve several times when I was first summoned. Like there was a multi-year period where I would go, Eve seems like a really cool game. I'm going to try it out. I have no idea what's going on. This UI is terrible. And then I'd stop playing for a bit, and then I go, "What? But it's so good." And then I'd bounce off again. Like that happened over and over and over from like 2010 to 2013 or something like that. Like it was really bad. I think a lot of people tend to see that, and from our corp recruitment stuff, at least, I know that a lot of people who join Reddit tend to have that happen. That may just be the people who join Reddit, but I would doubt that that's not a representative sample. So the number one biggest thing would be making the overview actually intelligible. At the very least, having a default overview pack. Right now, it's very difficult when you're coming into the game to go like, all right, so I have this spreadsheet that's on the right side of my monitor. I don't really know what it means. There's a lot of numbers on it, and it has all sorts of colors, none of which are super helpful to me. Uh, and people just kind of go like, okay, this is a shitty game. I'm done. There's a lot of since Eve was developed so long ago, there's a lot of things that have become kind of standard in a lot of games for UI elements that you don't really see with Eve, just because it's such an old game that's managed to hold on for this long, that I think could really do with some updating. Like you just at minimum implementing like the consensus stuff that tends to show up across like Sarah Schwa and ZTech S would really help and go a long way there. The other big one is the fits and similar. Like right now, it's even with the update to that UI, it's still a bit hard to interpret like what fits mean. So I think a revision of the fitting window would help a bit more. Like that pointer thing is actually that they've just come out with is actually pretty helpful for teaching other people like how fitting works and stuff, but it's not as helpful as actually having some more info on you can filter modules by like this is a low slot module or this is a shield module, that kind of thing, but you don't really know like why should I pick this low slot module? Should I have a low slot module? Like what am I doing here? And I think that could do with a lot more explanation within the fitting UI.
So, monetization is often a dirty word within the player base. However, as you're running for the CSM, you hopefully understand that it's a necessary part of CCP continuing to exist, while still something to be safeguarded against becoming too rampant. What is a new area of monetization that you would argue against, and what would be your argument as to convince CCP on why it shouldn't?
So, like, what is an area of monetization that should not happen in Eve?
I am asking you to draw a red line on where you would say, hey, this is not okay, CCP, and here is why.
Okay, I get it. Yeah. So yeah, the biggest one I can see that has the most chance of occurring from my perspective, based on their recent actions, is loot boxes. So there's been a shift towards those kind of randomized event boxes that you get that are not like true randomized, but they're like semi, like you get like your choice of skins within a specific area. And my fear is that one day CCP will go, okay, so we've had some success with these boxes where, I mean, a lot of times you just click a box and you get an item instead of getting the item. We've had success with this. Let's now maybe offer this on like the New Eden store or something like that. Like basically have like ship skin loot boxes as something, or even potentially more dangerously like society conscious slot ship loot boxes, like that kind of thing. Like I really think that is the most likely and most dangerous form of monetization that could happen to Eve, which would be bad for two reasons. The first one is in the case of boxes that give you like items, it would drastically offset the economy because Eve is pretty based around the players make the items, all and everything can be traced back to ore or gas or ice or whatever, with the exception of a few very specific things that are offered by NPCs. So introducing the ability to buy things directly off the store as opposed to having you buy Plex, which you sell for ISK, which you then can use to buy player-made items, it would be a very bad thing for the economy and kind of ruin what makes Eve Eve. The other reason it's bad is because I personally feel loot boxes in general are bad. Like it's very reminiscent of the whole casino thing, and casinos tend to be very effective for a reason, and that reason is because human nature likes having those wins from randomness. So I really do not like how a lot of companies, not just CCP, tend to be preying on that element of randomness and going like, hey, you can spin the wheels and then you get maybe a good skin or maybe you get a bad skin, but then try again and you have another chance. Like that's a really unhealthy way to approach a game, and it shows a lot of disrespect to the people who are playing it.
So this one is a little more open-ended. What do you plan to do on the What do you plan to do on the CSM in order to differentiate yourself from the other from the other members? So what do you plan to do to differentiate yourself if you're elected from the other members of the CSM?
Okay. So the biggest one that I think I've been doing well on is the sheer volume of information and town halls and platform positions, that kind of thing that I've been putting out there. I think I probably have the most of any candidate that's been running. Matterall obviously has a lot of connection to the media side of things because that's kind of what he does in Eve. But on the whole, I think I have a lot more detail out there. So I'd really like to continue that. Like my my website has a whole lot of stuff on it, and I'd like to keep that going. Like keep up my weekly posts, keep up my town halls, that kind of thing, and maintain that level of information distribution that you don't see from a lot of other candidates that tend to be focused a lot more inward towards their own alliances as opposed to outward towards the EVE community as a whole. Because while it is an unfortunate fact that to be elected in a lot of cases, you need to have the backing of a large like nullsec alliance or similar, I think it is important that even if those are the people who are primarily electing you, you still maintain a focus on not just that alliance, but EVE as a whole. Because ultimately, regardless of what alliance you're in, a stronger EVE is better for you in the long run. Like, even if your own alliance is being nerfed, if that nerf benefits the game as a whole, that's something that you should be advocating for. So I'd like to continue to do what I've been doing and keep putting out these long form updates and talking to as many different corporations and as many different alliances as possible.
Okay, so for my final question, what other non-incumbent candidate would you most like to see elected, either alongside yourself or in place of yourself?
I mean, the obvious answer for me here is Villy. Like that I assume anyone would just about expect going into here. Philly's got a lot of experience, and he's also in tests, so I interacted with him a whole lot, and therefore know him pretty well. So that's basically the answer that's almost definitely going to come out of that.
Okay, well, with all that said, I'd like to give you a few moments to make any final remarks and to put a full stop on why you think the listeners should vote for you.
I mean, basically, I recommend checking out my website at voteforcornak.com. Twitter is Cornak Firefist. I've got a post up on the EVE forums under the CSM section. I've started to, now that we're in campaign season, post my weekly posts on Reddit as well, so keep an eye out for those. I've actually got one coming out later today, which will probably be in the past when this interview actually comes out on nullsec, and then that'll be followed up by the lowsec one, or sorry, the highsec one, and then the wormhole one. So just take a look at my content, take a look at the platform positions I have. In particular, I'd recommend reading the Our Goals section under the About header, because that really goes into the things I feel are most important about EVE and why I am running for CSM in the first place. So make sure to vote for Cornak.